The document hit the table like a gunshot. Grace Grayson did not flinch. She had ridden 3 days through Arizona dust and desert heat to sit in this suffocating little office in Redemption Creek, and she was not about to let a piece of paper shake her. She pressed her gloved hands flat against the edge of the attorney's desk and leaned forward until she could read every word of it, every ink-scratched betrayal written in Harold Grayson's hand. The man across from her cleared his throat. He was small and pink-faced, with spectacles that kept sliding down his nose, and he looked at her the way men in towns like this always looked at women who arrived alone and unafraid. Like she was a problem that had not yet been correctly categorized. "Mrs. Grayson," he said, "I understand this comes as a surprise." "Nothing about my husband's choices surprises me, Mr. Finch," Grace said. Her voice was steady. Her heart was not. She read it again. Harold had left the Grayson Ranch, all 460 acres of prime Arizona Territory land, every head of cattle, every structure, every water right from the creek to the eastern ridge, to a man named Grant Stone. Not to her. Not to the woman who had married Harold Grayson in good faith, who had left her family innocent. Louis, who had survived 5 years in the territory beside a man she slowly discovered was a stranger wearing a familiar face, Grant Stone. She did not know the name. She had never heard Harold speak it. That more than the will itself felt like the cruelest part. "I intend to contest it," she said. Mr. Finch pulled at his collar. "Mrs. Grayson, the will was properly witnessed and notarized. It is legally sound. To contest it, you would need to prove undue influence, fraud, or that your husband lacked the mental capacity. Then I will prove one of those things," she said. "Where is Grant Stone?" The door behind her opened. She turned. The man who stepped through the doorway of that small, sun-hammered office in Redemption Creek was not what she expected. She had built an image in her mind during the 3-day ride from Tucson, something hard and calculating. A man with greedy hands and a crooked smile, the kind of opportunist who befriended lonely old ranchers for exactly this purpose. What she found instead was someone who stopped just inside the doorframe as if the sight of her was its own kind of collision. A tall man with dark eyes that caught the afternoon light through the window and held it, with dust on his coat and something in his expression that looked uncomfortably close to grief. He removed his hat. "Mrs. Grayson," he said quietly, "I was told you were coming." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then you know why I'm here." "Yes, ma'am. And you intend to simply keep what my husband left you." Grant Stone did not answer immediately. He moved to the chair on the opposite side of the attorney's desk and set his hat on his knee and looked at her with those dark eyes that gave nothing away and everything away at the same time. "I haven't decided what I intend," he said. That was not what she expected either. She had arrived in Redemption Creek with a mission as clear and straight as a rifle barrel. She would contest the will. She would expose whatever dark arrangement had existed between this man and her late husband. She would reclaim what was hers by right and by law, and by the 5 years of her life she had buried in Arizona soil alongside Harold. She had not come here to be complicated. She had not come here to look at a man's eyes and find them full of something she could not immediately name. She turned back to the attorney. "I will require copies of all correspondence between my husband and Mr. Stone over the past 3 years," she said. "I will require the names of the witnesses to this will. And I will require a room in this town for as long as it takes to pursue this matter through the territorial court." Mr. Finch was already sweating. She did not look at Grant Stone again as she left the office, but she felt his eyes on her back all the way through the door, and she carried that feeling out into the blazing Arizona afternoon like a coal she did not yet know what to do with. 6 months earlier, Grace had been living in a kind of suspended grief that she could not quite name as grief, because it was tangled up with relief and shame, and the complicated arithmetic of a marriage that had never been what she'd hoped. Harold Grayson had died in October of 1883, thrown from his horse on the eastern trail of the ranch, dead before the ranch hand who found him could ride back for help. The coroner in Tucson had been efficient and unsentimental. The funeral had been small. Grace had stood at the grave in her black dress and felt the Arizona wind pull at her veil and tried to locate the sorrow that was supposed to be there. She had found something. But it was not simple, and it was not clean, and it was not the grief of a woman who had lost a man she loved without reservation. Harold had been 20 years her senior when they married. She had been 23, newly arrived from St. Louis, where her father's dry goods business had collapsed in spectacular fashion, leaving the family in a state of quietly desperate gentility. Harold Grayson had been a friend of her father's, a man with land and money and a steady, serious manner that her father had described as solid. Solid. It had seemed like a good word then. She was 28 now. She knew that solid and cold were sometimes the same thing, wearing different clothes. She had not been unhappy in any dramatic way. There had been no violence, no cruelty, no spectacular betrayal. There had simply been distance. Harold had managed the ranch and she had managed the house, and they had moved through the same rooms like planets in separate orbits, politely maintaining their trajectories, occasionally nodding at one another as they passed. She had tried, in the early years. She had read books about ranching and learned the names of the cattle breeds and asked questions over dinner that Harold had answered with the efficient brevity of a man who considered conversation a practical tool rather than a pleasure. After the first year, she had stopped asking questions about ranching. After the second year, she had stopped asking questions at all. The letter from Mr. Finch had arrived in December, 3 months after Harold's death, and it had cracked open everything she thought she understood about the 5 years she had spent in that house. Grant Stone, named sole beneficiary. The ranch, the cattle, the land, the water rights. Everything. She had a small savings account in Tucson, money she had carefully, quietly accumulated from the household budget over 5 years, which should have given her a flash of guilt but mostly gave her a flash of vindication. She had a trunk of clothing, a good horse she had bought herself, and whatever legal rights a widow possessed in the territory of Arizona in January of 1884. Those rights were fewer than she would have liked, but she was not a woman who adjusted her ambitions to match what the law found convenient. She had ridden to Redemption Creek. The town was smaller than Tucson but larger than nothing, which was the most that could be said for most of the settlements scattered across that part of Arizona territory. It had a main street with a width that suggested optimism rather than necessity, a general store, a livery, a hotel that called itself the Territorial Grand with a confidence that its 2 stories and sagging porch did not entirely justify, a saloon, a church that was newer and better maintained than the saloon, and a law office that served simultaneously as the office of the only attorney within 40 miles. Grace had taken a room at the Territorial Grand on the day she arrived, which was the same day she walked into Mr. Finch's office, and the same day she first laid eyes on Grant Stone. That night, she sat at the small writing desk in her room and wrote a letter to her cousin Alina in St. Louis, describing the situation in the precise, controlled language of a woman who had decided not to feel anything she could not afford. She described the will. She described the attorney. She did not describe Grant Stone. She did not describe his eyes, which were the particular dark brown of creek water in shade, or the way he had said her name, Mrs. Grayson, not with the oily deference of a man trying to manage her, or the sharp dismissiveness of a man who had already decided she did not matter, but with something that sounded almost like recognition. She sealed the letter, blew out the lamp, and lay in the dark listening to the sounds of Redemption Creek settling into its nighttime routines, and tried not to think about the fact that Grant Stone had said he hadn't decided what he intended. What kind of man, given 460 acres of Arizona ranchland, hadn't decided what he intended? She would find out. That was what she was here for. The next morning, Grace was at the attorney's office when Mr. Finch arrived to unlock the door, which startled him considerably. She had a list. Mr. Finch did not look at her list with enthusiasm, but he looked at her with sufficient wariness to understand that enthusiasm was not going to be a prerequisite for compliance. She got the names of the will's witnesses. She got the date of its execution, which was 8 months before Harold's death, March of 1883, a detail that nagged at her in a way she could not yet articulate. She got a copy of the relevant sections of the Arizona territorial statutes pertaining to the rights of surviving spouses, which Mr. Finch produced with the resigned expression of a man who had hoped she would not ask for that particular document. She was sitting at a table in the hotel dining room, reading through everything, when Grant Stone walked in. He paused when he saw her. Then he crossed the room and stood at the edge of her table with his hat in his hands and that same quality of gravity about him that she had noticed the day before, a stillness that did not read as cold, but rather as the stillness of a man who had learned to be careful with himself. "May I?" he said, indicating the empty chair across from her. She looked at him over the papers. "Is there something you need to say to me, Mr. Stone?" "Yes," he said simply. She gestured at the chair. He sat down. He turned his hat in his hands twice and then set it on the seat of the fourth chair, the way a man does when he is trying to organize his thoughts, and then he looked at her directly in a way that made her want to look away, which annoyed her enough to keep her gaze exactly where it was. "I know what this looks like," he said. "I suspect you do," she said. "I want you to know that I did not seek this out. I did not encourage Harold to leave me the ranch. I told him when he first raised it that it was wrong, that you were his wife and the ranch should be yours." Grace set down the paper she had been holding very deliberately and looked at him. "He told you about it before he changed the will." "Yes." "And you objected." "Yes." "And yet the will was changed." "Yes." He paused. "Harold did what Harold decided to do. He wasn't a man who changed his mind once he'd made it up." She recognized the truth of that in her bones, felt it settle into the exact shape of her 5 years with Harold Grayson like water finding its level. "No," she said quietly. "He wasn't." A silence opened between them, not hostile exactly, but charged with all the unsaid things that happen when two people discover they are connected through a man they both knew and neither of them, for very different reasons, fully understood. "How did you know my husband?" she asked. Grant Stone looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. "He saved my life," he said, 11 years ago when I was 22 and considerably more foolish than I am now. I was working a cattle drive through New Mexico territory and got into a situation with 3 men who did not have good intentions, and Harold Grayson stepped in when he didn't have to. We stayed in contact after that." He paused again, and she noticed the pauses now, noticed that he used them the way other men used words, to find accuracy rather than to fill space. He wasn't easy to know, but he was a man who believed in paying debts. "Debts," Grace said. "He thought he owed me." Over the years, I tried to talk him out of that idea. Some men can't be talked out of a thing they've decided is their obligation. She thought about Harold and his silences and his straight-line thinking, and the way he had looked at her sometimes in those early years with something in his eyes that she had mistaken for love when it might have been. She now suspected the exact kind of debt-driven obligation that Grant Stone was describing. It was not a comfortable thought. "I have legal standing to contest this will," she said. "I intend to pursue it. I know. You're not going to fight me on it." He met her eyes. "I haven't decided." There it was again. That answer that should have frustrated her and instead did something entirely more troubling. It made her want to know what was happening inside the stillness behind his eyes. "Why haven't you decided?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I'm not sure the ranch should be mine," he said. "But I'm also not sure the situation is as simple as the will makes it look. And I think before either of us does anything we'll regret, we should both know the whole of it." She stared at him. "What do you mean, the whole of it?" He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. He set it on the table between them. It was addressed to him in Harold's handwriting, and it had been opened. "Harold sent me this 2 weeks before he died," Grant said. I didn't show it to Finch because I wasn't sure who to trust in this town. I'm showing it to you now because I think you deserve to read it before you decide how hard to fight." Grace looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then she picked it up and drew out the single folded sheet inside. She read it. She read it twice. When she set it down, her hands were steadier than they had any right to be, because what was happening inside her chest was a kind of earthquake that started at the center of things and worked its way outward. Harold had written, in his direct, unornamented hand, that he had changed his will because he believed Grace deserved better than the ranch, that the Arizona Territory was no place for a woman of her quality, that he had spoken with her father before the marriage about the arrangement, and that her father had agreed she would be provided for, and that his manner of providing for her was to ensure she could not keep herself in a place that had been slowly, year by year, taking things from her. That Grant Stone was an honest man and a capable one, and that he trusted him, and that the letter Grant held constituted a private moral obligation, not a legal one. Harold had been very clear on that, but a moral obligation to ensure that Grace received a cash settlement sufficient for her to build a proper life in a city where her intelligence and her spirit would not be wasted on dust and cattle, and the company of a man who had never known how to be what she needed. He had named a figure. It was significant. He had also written in the last paragraph in the same direct hand that he was sorry, that he knew he had not been what she deserved, that he had known it from the beginning and had not known how to fix it, and so had done, in the end, the only thing he could think of. He had tried to free her. Grace folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope and set it on the table. Grant Stone was watching her. "He never told me any of this," she said. "No," Grant said gently. "He wouldn't have. He talked to my father before the marriage." She heard the flatness in her own voice and could not help it. "He decided what was best for me before the marriage even began and then spent 5 years not telling me." "Yes. And now he's dead and he's still deciding what's best for me." She pressed her fingers against the envelope. "From the grave." "Grace," Grant said, and then stopped because he had used her first name without thinking about it. She could see the recognition of that cross his face. She found that she did not mind. That was new information about herself. "He meant well," Grant said. "I'm not saying the way he did it was right, but the intent, I know what the intent was," she said. "I've been reading Harold's intent for 5 years. I became something of an expert." She looked up from the envelope and directly at Grant Stone. "I want to see the ranch," he blinked. "I beg your pardon. The ranch, I want to see it. I haven't been back since Harold died. The ranch hands have been keeping it running. I've been paying them from Tucson, but I haven't gone back." She paused. "I want to see what I'm deciding about." He was quiet for a moment, then slowly he nodded. "I can take you out there," he said, "if that's what you want." "Tomorrow morning," she said. "I ride well. I won't need a slow pace." Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, something smaller and more private than a smile, but in the same territory. "I didn't imagine you would," he said. She left the dining room with the letter in her hand, and the earthquake still moving through her in slow, aftershock waves, and she walked upstairs and sat on the edge of her hotel bed, and let herself, very briefly, feel the full weight of everything Harold had tried to do for her and everything he had failed to do, and the strange, unsettling fact that the man sitting across from her downstairs had known about this letter for 2 weeks and had not touched a single acre of the ranch and had waited. She now understood for her to arrive. He had been waiting for her. She did not examine that feeling too closely, but she did not throw it away either. They rode out to the Grayson ranch the next morning in the winter light that came early and cold over the eastern mountains, painting the desert floor in shades of amber and copper that made even the scrub brush look intentional. Grace rode her own horse, a gray mare she had named September, and she was grateful for the way the animal moved beneath her, steady and responsive, nothing like the uncertain ground of the past 24 hours. Grant Stone rode a bay gelding that matched his manner, quiet and capable, and he did not make unnecessary conversation on the trail, which she appreciated. He pointed out landmarks when they were relevant. He named the mountains. He told her the water situation on the eastern portion of the ranch, which was the critical issue in any Arizona territory holding, and he told it with the precise efficiency of someone who had spent time learning it. "You've been out here," she said. "Recently." "A few times," he said. "Since Harold died, just to check the cattle situation. The hands, Milo, and the two brothers, Eli and Cord Dutton, they've been managing fine. But Harold asked me before he died to keep an eye on things." He glanced at her. "I've been trying to do that without overstep. And the settlement he mentioned in the letter," she said, "the figure he named, is that money accessible?" "Harold had it set aside," Grant said, "in a Tucson bank. The account is in my name as the will's beneficiary, but he made it clear in the letter what it was for. It's yours, Mrs. Grayson. I'll sign it over to you today if that's what you want." She looked at him across the space between their horses. "And the ranch?" "The ranch is more complicated," he said. "The cash, there's no legal complication. It's a matter of my choice and the bank. The ranch requires either you dropping the contest, which means accepting the will as written and the settlement Harold intended, or a court proceeding, which would take months and cost money and might go either way. Or you voluntarily transferring the deed," she said. "Yes," he said, "or that. But you haven't done that." "No, why not?" He was quiet for a long stretch of trail, long enough that she had started to think he would not answer, and then he said, "Because I wanted to understand the situation before I acted. Harold was not, as I've said, an easy man to know. When he made a decision, it was rarely simple. I wanted to understand why he did what he did before I undid it. And now." She said, "Do you understand it?" He turned to look at her, and the morning light was full on his face, and she saw something in his expression that she did not have a word for yet. "I think I'm beginning to," he said. The ranch appeared over the next rise, and Grace felt the familiar mix of reactions she always had when she saw it. A kind of recognition that was not exactly homecoming, because she had never quite felt at home there, and not exactly aversion either, because the land itself was beautiful in a harsh and uncompromising way, broad and open, and punctuated by the red rock formations that rose in the distance like patient monuments. The ranch house was stone and adobe, built to last by men who understood that the desert did not accommodate anything temporary. The outbuildings were in good repair. The cattle she could see in the near pasture were healthy. Whatever else Harold had been, he had been a good rancher, and the men he had employed had continued to be. Milo came out of the barn when he heard the horses. He was a weathered man in his 50s with a gray-shot beard and eyes that had spent decades squinting at the Arizona horizon. And when he saw Grace, he took off his hat and said, "Mrs. Grayson," with a warmth that surprised her, because she had not been sure the ranch hands had any particular feeling about her one way or the other. "Milo," she said, "how are Eli and Cord?" "Good, ma'am, good. We've been keeping things steady. Glad you came out." He glanced at Grant. "Mr. Stone." "Milo," Grant said. "Everything holding?" "Yes, sir." "Had a fence down on the north pasture last week. Cord fixed it. Water's good. We lost one heifer to a rattlesnake bite, but it was an older animal, not much loss." He delivered this the way all ranch hands delivered bad news, quickly and with context. "You want to walk through?" "I do," Grace said. "I'd like to see everything." They spent 3 hours walking the ranch, Milo guiding them through every structure and pasture, and Grace asked questions the whole time in the same precise way she had asked questions of Mr. Finch, not the questions of a woman performing interest, but the questions of someone genuinely trying to understand what they were looking at. She noted what needed repair. She asked about the water rights documentation. She asked about the cattle count and the market schedule, and what Harold's arrangement had been with the buyer in Tucson. Grant Stone walked mostly beside her and said very little, but she was aware of him with a consistency that she found irritating and did not quite manage to dismiss. He knew the land. She could see that in the way he moved across it, the ease of someone who had spent time here, who had absorbed the particulars of the place. He noticed things: a fence post that was beginning to lean, a section of the horse corral that would need new boards by spring, and he noted them quietly without making a production of it. She was discovering, a man who did not perform. He simply was. That was dangerous. She knew it was dangerous. She had come here with a clear purpose that had everything to do with legal rights and financial security, and nothing at all to do with the particular quality of a man's attention when he listened to her speak. The way Grant Stone listened, as if her words were worth the full weight of his concentration. Harold had never listened to her that way. She pushed the thought aside. She was not here to compare. Over a simple midday meal that Milo produced in the ranch house kitchen, the three of them sat at the long wooden table where Grace had eaten 100 meals with Harold in their orbit-distant silence, and the difference was so stark that she had to look at her plate for a moment to compose herself. Milo talked about the cattle market. Grant asked about the spring calving projection. Grace found herself drawn into the conversation naturally, offering observations about the eastern pasture she had made that morning, and both men listened and responded to her contributions with the equal matter-of-factness of people who assumed competence. After Milo went back to the barn, Grace and Grant were alone at the table with the remains of the meal and the afternoon light coming through the kitchen window. "I don't want to leave," she said. She hadn't meant to say it. It arrived from somewhere below her carefully managed surface and surprised them both. Grant was very still. "The ranch," he said. "This ranch. This land." She looked at the window, at the rectangle of desert and sky it framed. "I know Harold thought he was freeing me. I know he thought the best thing for me was a city and a fresh start, and a settlement large enough to make it comfortable. And maybe he was right that I was wasting myself here. I don't know. Maybe I was." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "But this is the first time in 5 years that I've walked this land and felt like it was mine. And I don't know if it's the walking or the being about to lose it." Or she stopped. "Or what?" Grant said. His voice was very quiet. She looked at him directly. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He held her gaze for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, long enough to have weight, and then he said, "Tell me what you want, Grace. Not what you think you should want, not what Harold decided you should want. What you actually want." No one had asked her that. In 28 years, in all the decisions that had shaped the geography of her life, from her father's plans for her future to Harold's well-intentioned arrangements, not one person had sat across from her and asked her what she actually wanted with the straightforward expectation that the answer would matter. She felt something crack open in her chest, not painfully, the way some cracks happen, but the way that ice cracks in spring, with the sound of something finally giving way to something warmer. "I want the ranch," she said. "I want to run it. I think I can run it. I've been watching how it works for 5 years, even if Harold didn't know I was paying attention, and I've been handling the finances from Tucson for the past 3 months, and I haven't made a single mistake." She paused. "I want to stay." Grant Stone looked at her for a long, searching moment. Then he said, "Then stay." "Just like that," she said. "Not just like that," he said. "Nothing about this is just like that, but the ranch should be yours. It should have been yours from the beginning. Harold was wrong in the way he did this, even if he wasn't wrong in what he wanted for you." He paused. "I'll begin the process of transferring the deed." She should have felt triumph. She had come here to fight for exactly this outcome, and now she was getting it without the fight. But what she felt was something more complicated than triumph, something that had a great deal to do with the man sitting across from her and the way the afternoon light was falling through the kitchen window and the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being truly seen. "Why?" she said. "You could keep it. The will is legally valid. Finch told me it's watertight. You could fight me and likely win." "Why would you give it up?" Grant was quiet for a moment. Then he said very simply, "Because it's the right thing to do, and because Harold asked me to look after you. I just think he was wrong about what looking after you means." He paused, and she saw something in his face that he was not quite hiding, some careful, controlled thing that was working hard to stay contained. "I don't think looking after you means making decisions for you. I think it means making sure you have what you need to make them yourself." Grace looked at him across the table in Harold's ranch house kitchen in the January afternoon light and felt the earthquake from the day before resolve, not end but resolve into something with a different character. Not destruction, more like clearing. "You're a very unusual man, Mr. Stone," she said. "Grant," he said, "please." A small silence. "Grant," she said, and felt the words settle into her mouth with a naturalness that both reassured and alarmed her. He stayed for dinner. She did not ask him to. He did not announce that he was staying. He simply helped Milo with the evening feeding and came back in and sat at the table, and they ate with the ranch hands. The four of them, Grace and Grant and Milo and Eli. Because Cord had ridden into town for supplies, and they talked about spring and the cattle market, and whether the winter had been mild enough to count as a good omen for the coming year. And Grace found herself laughing at something Milo said about a bull who had expressed opinions about a particular fence post. A real laugh. Not the polite social sound she had performed at Harold's dinners when guests came, but a laugh that started from somewhere genuine. Grant was watching her when she laughed. She noticed. She also noticed that he was not trying to hide the fact that he was watching her, which was different from the covert surveillance of a man with hidden motives. He was watching her the way someone watches something they find genuinely interesting. She rode back to Redemption Creek in the dark with a lantern and Grant riding beside her, and they talked the whole way, about Arizona Territory and about St. Louis, which he had visited once and found overwhelming, and about cattle and about law, and about what she planned to do with the eastern pasture once she had the proper forage established. She told him her ideas and he responded to them seriously, adding information where he had it, asking questions where he didn't, treating her analysis of the ranch's situation with the same respect he would have given it from any experienced rancher. She told him she had been teaching herself land management from books she ordered from Tucson. He said, "That explains why you knew about the water rights documentation before I told you." She said, "Did you test me?" "This morning on the trail when you talked about the water situation," he smiled. A real one, different from the almost smiles she had seen before. It changed his face. "A little," he admitted. "And you knew more than I expected," he said, which was already a good deal more than I'd have expected. She felt the warmth of that move through her and did not fight it. Fighting things was exhausting, she was beginning to understand, particularly when the things in question were not actually threats. 3 days passed, then a week. Grace remained at the ranch, settling back into its rhythms with a different energy than the 5 years before, because she was not now the orbit-held moon of Harold's arrangements, but rather the center of her own gravity, making decisions and watching them be carried out and feeling, for the first time, the specific satisfaction of work that was genuinely hers. Grant came out every other day. He had a small property of his own, a modest spread 15 miles north of the Grayson Ranch, cattle and a few horses and a house that he had built himself over 2 years, and he managed it with the same quiet efficiency with which he managed everything. He had no family nearby. He had come to Arizona Territory from New Mexico, following the cattle work, and had stayed because the land had agreed with something in him. He told her this over coffee on the ranch house porch one morning, and she listened and thought that she understood exactly what he meant. The way a particular place could agree with a person the way a key agrees with a lock, not forcing anything, just fitting. She told him about St. Louis, about her father's dry goods business, and how she had helped him with the accounts from the time she was 14, and had been better at it than anyone in the family, including her father, who had the grace to admit it even if he had never considered that a woman running accounts might extend beyond the domestic scale. She told him about the business's collapse, the creditors and the embarrassment and the very sudden necessity of the future appearing in the form of Harold Grayson. Grant listened without filling the silences with commentary. That quality of his, the ability to be fully present without crowding, was becoming something she looked forward to with an urgency she recognized as new information about her own feelings. "Were you ever happy with him?" he asked one afternoon when they were riding the eastern boundary of the ranch, checking the fence line she was having Eli repair section by section. It was a direct question. She respected it for being direct. "In the beginning," she said. "In the first year, there were moments. He was reliable, Harold. He was honest in his way. He never lied to me about anything I directly asked. He was not a cruel man." But she paused and Grant waited. "He didn't want to know me," she said. "That was the core of it. He wanted a wife in the practical sense, a companion in the present sense, and he was content with those things. He didn't want to know what I thought about things, or what I worried about at 3 in the morning, or what I might become if I had room to become it. He just wanted me there, and She stopped again. "Was," Grant said quietly. "Exactly," she said. "I just was." They rode for a moment in the clean, cold January air. "You're more than that," Grant said, and his voice had a quality she had not heard in it before, something low and certain and particular, not a performance, a statement of fact from a man who had reached a conclusion. She looked at him. He was looking at the fence line. His jaw was set in the way she had come to understand meant he was choosing his words carefully. "Grant," she said. He looked at her. "Don't say anything yet," she said. "That isn't equipped to be said yet." He held her gaze for a moment, and she saw the recognition in it, the understanding of exactly what she meant, that the thing growing between them was real and it needed room. It needed the proper care of time and honesty, and all the clearing away of Harold's legacy before either of them could stand in it cleanly. He nodded once. "Understood," he said. They rode the fence line in silence, and it was the best kind of silence, full rather than empty, the silence of two people who have said enough for now and are content to let the land and the morning and the growing thing between them do the rest of the work. Mr. Finch came out to the ranch a week later with the paperwork for the deed transfer. He arrived looking both professionally obligated and personally bewildered, which was a combination that Grace found quietly entertaining. He sat across from her and Grant at the kitchen table, Harold's table, and spread out the documents and walked them through the process with the resigned competence of a man who has learned not to predict what widows will do. Grant signed where he needed to sign. Grace signed where she needed to sign. It was accomplished in under an hour. When Finch left with his papers and his bewilderment, Grace held the transfer document in her hands and felt the weight of what had just happened settle into her with a permanence she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. Grant was across the table watching her. "Thank you," she said. "You don't need to thank me for doing the right thing," he said. "I'm going to anyway," she said. Because it wasn't required by law and it wasn't required by Harold, who was quite specific in his letter that the moral obligation was not a legal one. You did it because you chose to, and that is worth a thank you, regardless of what you think about owing. He looked at her. "Grace," he said and stopped. "You can say it now," she said softly. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "I've been trying very hard to be appropriate." "I've noticed," she said. "I've appreciated it, and I'm telling you now that you've been appropriate long enough." Something shifted in his face. The careful, controlled quality he carried, the stillness that was not cold but guarded, she could see it changing, not disappearing but opening, the way a door opens, deliberately, to something that had been waiting on the other side. "I came to that attorney's office 3 weeks ago," he said, "expecting to meet a woman who would confirm every dark thought I'd had about this situation. I expected bitterness and manipulation. I expected to feel justified in walking away from the whole complicated mess Harold had dropped in both our laps." He paused. "I did not expect you." "What did you get?" she said. "Someone who deserved better than she'd been given," he said. "Someone who had been managing a situation that would have flattened most people and was doing it with a precision and a grace." He paused again, and she noticed the use of her name as a word separate from herself, which made something warm move through her. "A grace that I couldn't look away from." Another pause. "I still can't look away from it," she said. "I came here to fight for a piece of land. I came here angry and certain and armed with every legal tool available to me, and I was absolutely prepared to be entirely ruthless about it." She folded her hands on the table. I did not expect to find someone who would simply hand it back. I didn't simply hand it back, he said. I handed it back because it was yours. There's a difference, she acknowledged. There is, he said. He was very still now, and the afternoon light was coming through the window again, and she thought that she was going to associate afternoon light in this kitchen with the rest of her life, with the moments that had mattered. Can I ask you something? Yes. What do you want now? He said. Not the ranch. You have the ranch. What do you want now? She looked at him across the table and let herself be entirely honest, which was a new kind of bravery, different from the bravery of riding 3 days alone through Arizona territory and walking into an attorney's office ready for a fight. This was the bravery of standing in the open with nothing between yourself and another person's attention. I want to know you, she said. All of it. The parts you guard carefully and the parts you don't. I want to know what you think about at 3 in the morning. She paused. I want someone who wants to know the same things about me. Grant Stone looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table slowly and covered her hands with his, and she felt the warmth of that contact travel all the way through her to some part of her that had been cold for a very long time. I already do, he said. Want to know? I've been wanting to know since about the first 20 minutes of knowing you, which I recognize is an alarming confession from a man who has been trying to conduct himself appropriately. She laughed, that real laugh again. It's not alarming, she said. Good, he said. And his hand was warm over hers, and the afternoon light was doing what it did, and the ranch was hers, and the man across the table was looking at her the way she had, without knowing it, been wanting to be looked at for a very long time. They were careful. She had been through enough upheaval in the past month to know that careful was the right pace, and Grant was a man who understood that the most important things deserved the space to grow without being forced. He continued to ride out to the ranch every other day, and then most days, and then they stopped counting the days because counting had become irrelevant. He was good with the hands. Milo, who was a quiet and perceptive man, watched the dynamic between Grace and Grant with an expression that contained both approval and the particular satisfaction of someone who has seen a right thing happen. Eli, who was 25 and energetically observant, was less subtle about his approval. Cord, who was 29 and the more reserved of the two brothers, simply worked harder when Grant was there, which was its own form of endorsement. Grace did not lack for work. Running a 460-acre cattle ranch in Arizona territory was not a task that left large quantities of unscheduled time, which she found she preferred. She managed the accounts with the precision she had always had for numbers. She made decisions about the spring calving schedule that Milo agreed with and complimented her on, not in the manner of someone surprised that she had made them correctly, but in the manner of someone who had expected competence and received it. She rode the fence lines. She learned the cattle market in Tucson with a thoroughness that the buyer there, a Mr. Ashby, found slightly intimidating and ultimately respected. She also wrote to her cousin Alina in St. Louis letters that were considerably more candid than the first one, and Alina's responses arrived with increasing delight and an accumulation of questions about Grant Stone that Grace answered honestly and at length. She did not write to her father. That conversation needed more time. Grant told her about his childhood in Texas, about the father who had worked cattle his whole life and died of a fever when Grant was 17, about the 2 years of drifting work before the cattle drive to New Mexico, where Harold Grayson had stepped in and changed the trajectory of things. He told her about the years after that, building a reputation as a reliable hand, and then as a reliable foreman, saving enough to buy his own small spread, learning the land management the same way she had learned it, by paying close attention to everything around him and treating every piece of information as worth keeping. He asked her about her reading. She told him about the books she ordered from Tucson and the books she had sent from St. Louis. She told him about the philosophy she had read at 17 that had permanently altered the way she thought about people's choices and the circumstances that shaped them. He asked what she meant specifically, and she explained it, and he listened with that full attention that still felt, months in, like the most generous thing anyone had given her. She read to him sometimes in the evenings from whatever she was currently working through, and he would sit across from her with his coffee and listen, occasionally asking her to stop so they could discuss a particular passage. And those evenings became her favorite hours, the accumulation of two people learning the shape of each other's minds and finding it consistently more interesting than the last time. They were in love. She knew this. She suspected he had known it somewhat before she did, because he was a man who did not rush to conclusions but also did not waste time denying them once reached. She arrived at it in stages, the way she arrived at most important things, through the accumulation of evidence until the conclusion was inescapable. The evidence was everything. The way he treated her intelligence as a given. The way he disagreed with her sometimes, directly and without apology, which she found electrifyingly respectful because Harold had never disagreed with her about anything, which she now understood was not because Harold had agreed with her, but because Harold had not been paying sufficient attention to form an opinion. The way Grant laughed, which was rare enough to be notable but genuine enough to be worth waiting for. The way he looked at her land, her ranch, with the same care and affection she felt for it herself. The way he had, without ceremony or announcement, simply become the person she wanted to tell things to. He asked her to marry him in April, on the eastern ridge where the scrub brush was blooming and the view extended far enough to make you believe in the scale of things. He did it simply, without elaborate staging, which was consistent with everything she knew about him. "I'm not Harold," he said. "I'm not going to tell you what's best for you or make arrangements on your behalf or keep things from you with good intentions. I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to disagree with you sometimes. I'm going to ask your opinion before I make decisions that affect both of us." He paused. "I would very much like to make decisions that affect both of us." She looked at him on the eastern ridge with the spring sun behind him and the ranch spread below them, and everything she had fought for and built in the past 3 months solid and real and entirely hers, and she said yes with the full weight of someone who had taken the time to know exactly what she was saying yes to. They were married in June of 1884, in the church in Redemption Creek that was newer and better maintained than the saloon. The ceremony was conducted by Reverend Allard, who was a large, gentle man who had built the church himself with help from the town, and who married people with a straightforward warmth that Grace appreciated. Milo and Eli and Cord Dutton stood at the back of the church in their clean shirts and looked pleased in the restrained way of men who were pleased but would not say so. Eleanor came from St. Louis, and Grace had not expected how much it would mean to have her cousin standing beside her, and it meant a great deal. Grace wore a dress of blue wool, not white, because she was a widow, and because blue was the color she had always thought suited her, and she had spent 5 years wearing the colors Harold's household seemed to call for, and this was her wedding now. Grant wore his good suit and his hat, and looked at her when she came down the church aisle with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life, the face of a man who was not performing any emotion whatsoever, but simply having all of them. Mr. Finch attended. He had adjusted, over the months, to Grace Grayson's existence, and had settled into a relationship with her that was professional and slightly wary, in the way of a man who has learned that certain women require more mental preparation than he typically budgets for. The reception was at the ranch, and it was the most life the ranch house had ever seen, with people from town and neighboring spreads and the Dutton brothers playing fiddle and guitar, with an enthusiasm that more than compensated for their limited technical precision. And Grace danced with Grant in the yard under the June stars, and thought that this was the moment she would mark as the beginning of her actual life. Not the day she was born, or the day she married Harold, or even the day she rode into Redemption Creek. But this, right now, with his hand on her back, and the music and the stars, and everything that had come before resolving into the clean, clear fact of where she stood. He built onto the ranch house in the late summer, not because it was too small for two people, but because he had ideas about what it could be, a proper study for her books, a larger kitchen because she had developed opinions about kitchens over the past year, and Harold's had not reflected them, a second bedroom for what they both, without a great deal of explicit conversation, understood would be needed eventually. Grace ran the ranch with the full competence she had always possessed and the confidence that competence, properly practiced, generates. The spring calving went well. The summer market was better than the previous year. She renegotiated the arrangement with the Tucson buyer with a firmness that surprised him and a reasonableness that convinced him, and the result was better for the ranch's margins without damaging the relationship. She wrote to her father in the summer, after the wedding, and the letter she wrote was careful and honest and neither angry nor accommodating beyond what was true. She told him about the will and what she had learned from Harold's letter, and her own thinking about the arrangement that had been made when she was 23. She told him about Grant. She told him she was well and that the ranch was thriving and that she did not hold what had happened against him entirely, but that she wanted the truth acknowledged between them. Her father's reply came in September. It was not a long letter, but it was an honest one, which was the most she could have asked for. He acknowledged what had happened. He said he had thought he was doing right by her. He said he could see now that right by her had not been adequately defined. He asked if he could visit. She wrote back and said yes. The territorial court resolved the will contest, which Grace had technically filed but which now required formal withdrawal without incident in August. Mr. Finch handled the paperwork with his customary resigned efficiency. The case was closed. The deed was properly recorded in Grace Stone's name. Everything was clean and legal and final. Grant's property 15 miles north came into the picture in the fall, when they sat down with the practical question of what to do with it. They discussed it the way they discussed everything, directly and in full, with all opinions on the table. The conclusion they reached was that Grant would continue to manage it, but would bring in a resident foreman, a man named Watts who had worked for a neighbor and was looking for his own operation, to run the day-to-day. The income from that property would go into a separate account that they both agreed should be the beginning of whatever they decided to do next with the land they had, whether that meant expansion or other investment, or simply a reserve for the dry years that Arizona territory inevitably produced. The decision was reached in an hour and a half over coffee and paper, and a good deal of genuine disagreement about the foreman's salary that resolved itself through both of them making concessions based on the actual merits of each other's arguments, which was Grace's favorite method of resolution, and was, she was increasingly convinced, the only method that actually worked. She was happy. She had not been entirely sure she remembered what that felt like, or whether what she had felt in the earlier parts of her life that she had called happiness had simply been the absence of acute unhappiness, which is a different thing. This was not the absence of anything. This was the presence of everything she had not known she had been missing, which was the presence of someone who made the world larger rather than smaller, who added to her rather than subtracted from her, who was interested in all the parts of her that she had previously kept carefully contained, because there had been no one who wanted to see them. She thought about this sometimes in the evenings when they were reading or talking or simply sitting in the quiet that had become a comfortable geography between them, and she felt the full strangeness of the path that had led here, Harold's strange posthumous arrangement, the 3-day ride to Redemption Creek, the envelope on the attorney's table, the will that had turned out to be something other than a betrayal. It had been Harold's limited, awkward, insufficient, but ultimately not unkind attempt to put her in the path of a better life. She had not forgiven Harold entirely, but she had arrived at something more complex than unforgiveness, a kind of understanding that held all the things that had been wrong without requiring her to pretend they were right, while also holding the fact that the wrong road had led her somewhere right. In November of 1884, she told Grant she was expecting their first child. He was at the kitchen table when she told him, going over the cattle count with the focused attention he gave all ranch business. And when she said it, he set down his pencil and looked at her for a long moment, and she watched the news travel through him, saw it arrive and take root and bloom into something on his face that was complete and unguarded, and as close to perfect as human expression could be. He stood up and came around the table to her and put his hands on her face, his large, careful hands, and looked at her with everything he was, no guard, no distance, just this man who was entirely present in the specific way that was his particular gift to her. "Grace," he said very softly, the way he had been saying her name for months, as if it were something to be held carefully. "I thought you should know," she said, which made him laugh, and then she was laughing too, and he wrapped his arms around her in the kitchen where they had first sat across from each other as strangers, and the afternoon light had come through the window, and everything had begun its slow, inevitable turn toward this. Her father visited in December, staying at the Territorial Grand for a week. He was older than she remembered him and smaller in some way she attributed to the years and the weight of things, and he sat across from Grant Stone at the ranch house table, with the careful assessment of a man trying to determine whether the judgment of his daughter, whom he had not previously trusted to make her own determinations, was sound. What he found was a man who met his gaze directly and spoke plainly and clearly loved his daughter in a way that required no performance and no reassurance. Grace's father was a practical man, which was both his limitation and, on occasion, his virtue. He assessed what was in front of him and arrived at a conclusion. He stayed a week and left saying that Grace looked well and that the ranch was impressive and that he was glad things had worked out. Which was, Grace reflected, probably the most her father could do, and she decided it was enough. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was cold by Arizona Territory standards, which meant it was merely bracing rather than brutal, and Grace found the cold months productive in the way of forced domesticity, time for the books she had been intending to read, time for the correspondence she had been letting accumulate, time for the long evenings with Grant where they mapped out the next year's plans with the pleasure of two people who have discovered that planning together is its own form of intimacy. He was, she was finding, full of things she did not know yet. She had known early on that he was intelligent and careful and kind, but she was still encountering new rooms in him, new qualities that presented themselves as the trust between them deepened and the need to be contained lessened. He had opinions about poetry, not casual opinions, real ones, developed from actual engagement with the texts, and he had arrived at them like everything else, by paying close and honest attention. He had a talent for reading people that he used, characteristically, quietly, not for manipulation but for understanding, and she could see it operating sometimes in his interactions with Milo and the Dutton brothers and the townsfolk in Redemption Creek. The precise adjustments he made to be what each person needed from him, not because he was performing, but because he was genuinely attentive to what people needed. She told him about this observation one evening. He said, "I learned it early. When you grow up with limited resources, you learn to pay close attention to what matters." What mattered, she said. My father, he said, reading what he needed. Whether it was a practical day or a hard day, whether he needed company or quiet, he paused. He was a good man. I miss him still. She reached across and took his hand, the way he had once reached across the attorney's table and taken hers, and he turned his hand and held hers with the steady warmth that was one of the things she had added to the list of things about Grant Stone that she would keep, the way he held her hand, as if he were entirely certain that it was exactly where his hand should be. Their son was born in July of 1885, in the room they had prepared carefully over the spring months, with the attention of two people who take preparation seriously. Grace's labor was long and the ranch was far from town, but the doctor from Redemption Creek, Dr. Haverson, who was a competent, unsentimental woman in her early 40s, who had come west with the frontier's need for medical care, and had stayed because the work was honest, and the need was constant, arrived in good time, and managed the situation with the calm authority that Grace had come to appreciate in the people she relied on. Grant stayed within earshot the entire time in the way of a man who has decided that pacing the parlor is insufficient, but knows that the bedroom is not his territory at this particular moment. Grace was aware of his presence like warmth through a wall, and found it more comforting than she would have expected, the simply knowledge that he was there, that he had not gone to the barn or the pasture or anywhere that put more distance between them than was strictly necessary. The baby was healthy and loud in his announcements about having arrived, and Dr. Haverson handed him to Grace with the satisfied expression of a woman whose work has gone well, and Grace held him in the July light and felt the weight of him settle into the crook of her arm with the rightness of something that had been intended. Grant came in and sat beside her on the bed with the careful presence of a man making sure he was exactly what was needed and nothing in excess, and looked at his son with the same unguarded completeness he had shown when she told him she was expecting, and said nothing for a long time, just held the moment with both hands. "His name," Grace said. "Whatever you want," Grant said. "I was thinking James," she said. "For your father." She felt the slight change in him, the small internal movement of something touched in a place that mattered, and he looked at her with the full directness of that dark gaze and said, "Yes, James." He paused. "Thank you for that." "It seemed right," she said simply. James Stone grew into his first months with the healthy insistence of a baby who has decided the world is interesting and demands to be told about all of it. Grace managed the ranch from a modified schedule through his earliest weeks, which Milo and the Duttons handled with an adaptability that impressed her, and returned to full operations by September with the efficiency of a woman who had decided that motherhood and ranch management were both too important to do poorly, and had therefore organized herself accordingly. Grant was the kind of father she had, somewhere in the back of her knowing, believed he would be present, interested, fully engaged with the small, particular person that James was becoming, alert to his individual qualities rather than his status as an infant in general. He would take James out to the corrals in the late afternoons when the baby was calm and point out the horses and name them, which James found mesmerizing, his small face turned toward the animals with an intensity that his parents found both funny and entirely recognizable. The year turned. The ranch prospered. Grace's relationship with Mr. Ashby in Tucson had evolved from slightly intimidating to mutually respectful, and the terms she had negotiated held steady. She expanded the cattle herd selectively, prioritizing quality over quantity in a way that required more short-term discipline, but produced better long-term margins. And Grant's input on the cattle genetics side of this decision had been the kind of practical expertise that complemented her numbers-based approach with specific knowledge about what the market was likely to favor. The town of Redemption Creek grew, slowly, in the way of territorial towns that had found their footing without losing their character. A school opened in the fall of 1885, which was relevant to Grace and Grant in the particular way of parents of a child, who is currently enthusiastically studying horse behavior, but will eventually need other kinds of education. The school was run by a young teacher named Miss Calloway, who had come from Ohio, with the commitment and slightly unpreparedness of a new educator in a frontier town, and who was rapidly gaining the practical experience to go with her commitment, which Grace respected. Grace became, gradually and without particular intention, one of the more influential figures in Redemption Creek's civic life, not through political means, but through the specific authority of someone who is consistently capable and consistently honest, and consistently treats everyone she deals with as someone worth dealing with seriously. Women in the territory had limited formal legal standing, which she found both practically frustrating and motivating in a larger sense. And she had conversations with other women in Redemption Creek about this that began casually and became, over time, something with more organization and more purpose. She wrote about some of this to Alina, and Alina's responses suggested that things in St. Louis were not entirely different in their particular frustrations, though they manifested differently in a city than in a territory town. Grant did not find any of this alarming or threatening, which she had noted was not the universal response of husbands to wives with civic opinions. He found it interesting, engaged with her thinking about it, offered his own perspective on the specific legal mechanisms involved with the particular knowledge of a man who had dealt with territorial law from several angles, and trusted her judgment about how to proceed. She loved him for this specifically and articulately. She told him so one evening, not in the general romantic sense of "I love you," which she told him regularly and meant with her whole self, but in the specific sense of "I love that you are this." He had looked at her with a warmth that he no longer contained and said, "I love that you are everything you are, all of it, even the parts that make Mr. Finch nervous." She laughed. "Especially those parts," she said. "Especially those parts," he agreed. In the spring of 1886, they had a long, serious conversation about the future of the ranch. Sitting at the kitchen table with their papers and their coffee in the early morning, while James was still asleep. The kind of conversation that took several evenings to complete, because it touched on everything from the practical cattle operation to what they wanted their life to look like in 20 years. The conclusion they arrived at was expansion, but careful expansion, acquiring the adjacent parcel to the south, which had come available when its owner, old Mr. Pierce, had decided to move to Tucson to be near his daughter, and which added another 120 acres to the Grayson Ranch's holdings, bringing the total to nearly 600 acres of Arizona Territory land that Grace Stone ran with the combination of intelligence and practicality, and genuine love for the place that made it something more than just a business operation. Watts, the foreman they had brought in to manage Grant's northern property, had proven himself capable and honest, and the arrangement there was producing steady income that gave the ranch the financial cushion that made risk management easier. Grant had been right about him, which Grace acknowledged directly, and Grant received without false modesty, simply noting that he'd found Watts's references compelling and was glad the conclusion held. She was pregnant again by the summer of 1886, and this time the news traveled between them more easily, not because it was less significant but because they had more practice at receiving large things together without dropping them. 2 years almost exactly, Grant observed. "James will either be thrilled or deeply unimpressed," Grace said. "Both," Grant said, "in rapid alternation." "Like his father," she said. He smiled. "His father has an excellent poker face." "His father's poker face is entirely transparent to at least one person," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. "I know," he said. "I consider that the best outcome." Their second child, a girl they named Clara after Grant's mother, was born in February of 1887, healthy, and with the strong opinions about her circumstances that seemed to be a family trait. James, who was 18 months old and in the full grip of toddlerhood's absolute certainties, regarded his sister with the complicated expression of someone who has not yet determined whether this development is good news or not. And then, when Clara grabbed his finger with the inexorable grip of a newborn, seemed to decide that she was at minimum interesting. Dr. Haverson was present again, and as competent as before, and stayed for a cup of coffee afterward and told Grace, over the kitchen table, that she had done this sort of thing before and would likely do it again, and should probably think about whether Redemption Creek might benefit from a midwife permanently stationed in the area, because the nearest one was 20 miles away, and this was a territory, and territory towns needed medical infrastructure like they needed water. Grace listened to this with the particular attention she paid to problems that had practical solutions if the right person decided to solve them. She discussed it with Grant that evening, and with Milo in passing the next day, and with two women from town the following week. And within 3 months there was a midwife in Redemption Creek, supported partly by a fund that Grace had organized and partly by a modest practice fee schedule that was within the range of what most families in the area could manage. Mr. Finch, who had initially regarded the fund as something he would need to watch carefully, eventually became one of its more reliable legal advisors, a development that Grace noted with quiet satisfaction as evidence that people were capable of growing into better versions of themselves when given the proper conditions and sufficient evidence that it was worth doing. The spring of 1887 was warm, and the calving went exceptionally well, and the Grayson Ranch, which was how it was still known in Redemption Creek regardless of the stone in Grace's name now, had its best financial year since she had taken ownership. She reviewed the accounts in April, and then reviewed them again, because she enjoyed the numbers when they told good stories, and then brought them to Grant with the same directness she brought everything else, and they sat together and made decisions about what to do with the good year's results in the way that was their own particular version of happiness, two people of equal intelligence and different knowledge, making a future together on purpose. "We should hire another hand," Grant said. "Cord is doing the work of 1.5 men and he knows it, and eventually he'll find somewhere that compensates him accordingly." "I've been thinking the same thing," Grace said. "I talked to Cord last week. He said he wasn't looking, but he also said that with the South Pasture expansion, the work was getting to the edge of manageable for 3 men. 4 in the off-season," Grant said. "Full-time fourth through calving and summer. I can find the margin for a full-time fourth year-round," she said, "if we're strategic about the operating budget in the winter months. Can you?" He looked at the papers, not doubting her, just interested in the mechanism. She showed him. He followed the logic. He said, "The South Pasture feed cost in winter is the variable. Which is why I want to talk about the supplemental hay situation," she said, and they were off. And an hour later they had a plan that both of them were satisfied with. And James, who had been determinedly present throughout this entire conversation on the floor nearby with a series of wooden blocks that Milo had made him, had managed to construct something that bore a meaningful resemblance to a fence, which both of his parents found significant. The fourth hand they hired was a young man named Victor Reyes, whose family had ranched in Arizona territory for 2 generations, and who knew cattle and land and water with the deep knowledge of someone born to it. He was 23 and efficient and quiet, and fit into the rhythm of the ranch the way a good addition is supposed to fit, making the whole stronger without changing what it essentially was. Milo approved of him, which was the most reliable endorsement Grace could have asked for, because Milo's assessments of people had been consistently accurate over 3 years of her observation. The late summer of 1887 brought a drought that was not catastrophic but was serious, and Grace managed it with the careful, forward-thinking water resource management she had been building toward since she first understood the water rights documentation. They had the best water situation on their section of the valley, which was not luck, but the result of deliberate maintenance and strategic infrastructure investment that Grant had helped her design in the ranch's first spring together. The drought meant neighbors in difficult positions, and this was where Grace Stone and the Grayson Ranch became something more than a well-run operation and became part of the community in a specific and tangible way. She did not have infinite water to share, but she had some to share without putting her own operation at genuine risk, and she shared it without debt or expectation, the way Harold had once shared himself with a young man in New Mexico territory who needed it. She thought about that sometimes. The long lines of consequence. Harold's imperfect decision to save a young man's life had eventually produced Grant Stone, capable and honest and standing beside her in the Arizona drought of 1887, with his hand on the gate of the water channel, calculating how much they could give. She would not have chosen Harold's path to get here, but she found she could hold the whole of it, the difficult and the good, without needing to reduce it to one or the other. Grant saw her expression in a quiet moment on the water channel and said, "What are you thinking?" "About Harold," she said. He was quiet, not requiring more of an explanation than she was ready to give. "I think," she said slowly, "that he did what he thought was right. Not what was actually right, but the best version of right that he could see from where he was standing." She looked at the water moving in the channel, the essential, irreplaceable water of Arizona territory. "I don't forgive the way he managed things. But I think I understand it now in a way that doesn't require me to be angry about it anymore." "That's generous," Grant said. "It's also honest," she said, "which is more useful to me than generous." He smiled, the real one. She had been collecting those smiles for 3 years now, and she was not anywhere near tired of them. "Grace," he said, "yes. I think about what my life would have looked like if I'd been a different kind of man. If I'd walked into Finch's office and decided that the will was legal and therefore I was entitled and that was the end of it." He paused. "If I hadn't wanted to understand before I acted." She looked at him. "I would have missed all of it," he said simply. "All of you." She reached up and touched his face with her hand, the way he so often touched hers, deliberately, as something worth being careful with, and said, "So would I." They stood there for a moment on the water channel in the Arizona summer, two people who had found each other through a dead man's imperfect love and a legal document, and the specific, irreplaceable fact of two people who had each, for different reasons, decided that doing the right thing was more important than doing the easy thing. The drought broke in September. The cattle were in good condition. The south pasture, with its new forage establishment, came through better than the older sections, which confirmed the investment decision they had made in the spring. Victor Reyes had proven himself not just capable, but genuinely skilled with the cattle management during the difficult months, and Grace gave him a wage increase in October that he received with the quiet dignity of someone who had expected to earn rather than be given. James turned 2 in July and became, in the months following, a fully mobile and strongly opinionated person whose primary interests were horses, dogs, anything that Milo was doing, and the systematic investigation of every corner of the ranch house and its immediate surroundings. Clara at 8 months was beginning to demonstrate the personality that would become fully apparent in the years ahead, a focused, watchful quality punctuated by sudden and determined opinions, which both her parents recognized, and which Milo observed with the expression of a man who could see exactly what was coming. The Reverend Allard visited the ranch in November for a Sunday dinner and stayed for 3 hours talking about the territory's future, the question of statehood, which had been discussed for years without resolution, and the particular challenges of building legal and social institutions in a place that was still, in many respects, improvising its own civilization. Grace had strong opinions about the legal institution side of things, which Reverend Allard engaged with seriously and with evident respect, and Grant contributed the specific knowledge of a man who had dealt with territorial law in its most practical applications. It was a good dinner and a good conversation, the kind that left you feeling that the future was something worth the effort of thinking carefully about. In December of 1887, just before the 3rd anniversary of the day Grace Grayson had ridden into Redemption Creek with fury and legal papers, and a heart full of righteous determination to fight for what was hers, she sat in the study of the ranch house where her books occupied the shelves from floor to ceiling, and her desk held the current season's accounts, and the letter she was writing to Eleanor, and the small portrait of her and Grant that had been taken by the photographer who had come through town in the summer, and she thought about everything that had brought her to this room. The dark past she had ridden through to get here, Harold's cool distance, her father's arrangements, the 5 years of learning to make herself small enough to fit the space she'd been assigned. The forced choice of a legal battle that had resolved itself into something she could not have predicted. The hidden motives she had been prepared to find, and had found only in Harold's letter, which had turned out to be not manipulation but a love letter in the only language Harold Grayson had ever been able to speak. The man who had been on the other side of that table in Finch's office, who had looked at her with those dark eyes that gave nothing away and everything away at the same time, who had chosen the right thing over the easy thing, who had turned out to be the answer to a question she had not known she was asking. She heard James's voice from the kitchen, the particular rising tone of a 2-year-old making a request that will not be denied, and Grant's voice underneath it, patient and warm and fully present. She heard Clara's commentary from somewhere nearby, the decisive vowels of a baby with opinions. She finished the letter to Alina. She described the drought's resolution and Clara's newest sounds and James's recent discovery that horses could be talked to and would respond, and the South Pasture's forage and the plans they had for spring. She described the town, which was growing. She described Grant, which required several paragraphs because she was a person who believed in accuracy, and Grant did not compress easily into fewer words than he required. She wrote near the end, "I arrived in this town with everything I owned and a will to fight for what had been taken from me. I left that office the first day with more questions than I came in with, and a man's eyes on my back that I could not stop thinking about, though I tried very hard to stop thinking about it. I have the ranch. I have more than the ranch. I have what the ranch always should have been, which is a home. Not a place I was placed in or a situation I was managing, but a real home with a real life in it, and a man who is more than anything I had the sense to ask for. I don't know that I believe Harold intended all of this, but I think, in his limited and roundabout and infuriating way, he intended something like it." She sealed the letter. She put on her coat and walked out of the study and through the kitchen, where Grant was at the table with James on his lap and Clara in the crook of his arm, and the evening light doing what it always did in this kitchen, turning everything gold. He looked up when she came in. "Letter done," he said. "Letter done," she said. James reached for her immediately with the absolute priority of someone who has determined that both parents should be present at all times, and she came to the table and kissed the top of her son's head, and then Grant's cheek, and sat down beside them in the warm light of the Arizona winter evening, with the ranch around them and the land that was hers stretching out in every direction into the dark, and the life she had built in it with the man she had not expected, and had found anyway through the exact sequence of events that had seemed, for a time, like betrayal, and had turned out to be the only road that could have led her here. "Spring planning," Grant said, not as a demand but as an offer, as in, shall we, because there was nothing they both liked better than planning the future together. "Spring planning," she agreed. James, in the manner of all 2-year-olds at the transition point between evening and bedtime, made his position on the spring planning clear by the application of total, sudden, complete unconsciousness against his father's chest, which was both an announcement and a compliment. Clara, regarding this development with wide eyes, appeared to be reserving judgment. Grace looked at her children and her husband and her home and felt, simply and entirely, exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because someone had arranged it that way, not because a will had directed it or a father had decided it or a dead man's good intentions had pointed toward it, though all of those things were part of the road, but because she had chosen it. Every step of the road that mattered she had chosen. She had ridden to Redemption Creek. She had sat across from a man and asked him what he intended. She had said what she wanted. She had said yes on the eastern ridge. She had chosen this life, entirely and on purpose, with everything she was. Outside, the Arizona night was clear and cold and full of stars, the particular dense, impossible stars of the territory where the sky had room to be itself. And inside, the lamp was burning and the children were sleeping or nearly sleeping, and Grant was watching her across the kitchen table with his dark eyes that had never in 3 years stopped being the most interesting thing in her field of vision. "What are you thinking?" he asked, the way he so often asked, because he always wanted to know. "That I'm glad I came," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand with the steady warmth that was his particular gift to her, the certainty of his touch, the total absence of doubt in the way he held on. "So am I," he said, "every single day." The lamp burned. The children slept. The Arizona stars did what they had always done over that particular stretch of ground, indifferent to the stories playing out below them but present for all of them nonetheless. And the Grayson Ranch, Grace Stone's ranch, this land she had fought for and found herself in, settled into the quiet dark of a winter night with all its people safe inside it, as solid and real and entirely itself as anything that has been properly, deliberately, and lovingly built.